December 19th, 1941. The frozen steppes outside Moscow stretch endlessly under a merciless Russian winter. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber crouches in a makeshift foxhole, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the -40 air. His fingers, blackened by frostbite, fumble with a crumpled letter from home, words of pride and glory, now seeming as distant as the warmth he once knew. Around him, the scattered remnants of Army Group Center lie broken against the Russian earth, their dreams of swift victory buried beneath 3 feet of snow and the weight of a brutal reality no Nazi propaganda film had ever shown them. The sound that haunts this moment is not the triumphant march of jackboots on conquered pavement, but the hollow scraping of metal spoons against empty tin cans, a sound that would echo through the conscience of a generation. This moment of desolation, this convergence of shattered dreams and frozen desperation, represents more than the failure of a single military campaign. It embodies the culmination of a journey that began not in the halls of power, but in the beer halls of Munich, where a failed Austrian artist transformed personal bitterness into a movement that would consume the world. The path from Adolf Hitler's early political awakening to this frozen wasteland outside Moscow reveals not just the rise and fall of the Third Reich, but the fundamental collision between totalitarian ambition and the enduring human spirit of freedom. The story begins not with grand pronouncements or military parades, but with the quiet desperation of post-war Germany. In November 1918, as the armistice bells rang across Europe, Germany found itself not merely defeated, but spiritually shattered. The Kaiser had fled, the economy lay in ruins, and the proud German people faced the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. Into this void of national identity stepped a man whose own failures would mirror and magnify those of his adopted nation. Hitler, rejected from art school, wounded in war, and adrift in a rapidly changing world, discovered in politics what he had never found in painting: a canvas vast, enough for his ambitions and dark enough to hide his inadequacies. The transformation of Hitler from a marginal agitator to the Führer of Germany represents one of history's most studied political ascensions, yet its true horror lies not in its inevitability, but in its avoidability. In the early 1920s, the Nazi Party was a collection of malcontents and misfits. Their failed Munich beer hall putsch in 1923 landing Hitler in prison and seemingly ending his political career before it had truly begun. Yet, from this apparent defeat, Hitler extracted his greatest victory: the time and platform to write Mein Kampf, the blueprint for his future conquest not just of Germany, but of German minds and souls. The Germany that emerged from the chaos of the Weimar Republic was a nation hungry for meaning, desperate for strength, and vulnerable to the intoxicating promise of restored greatness. Hitler understood, with an intuition that bordered on the demonic, that people's deepest need was not for truth, but for purpose, not for reality, but for hope, however false. The Nazi rallies of the late 1920s and early 1930s were not political gatherings, but religious revivals, complete with sacred symbols, ritual chants, and the promise of national resurrection. The swastika, that ancient symbol of good fortune perverted into an emblem of hate, became as central to German identity as the cross had once been to medieval Christianity. By January 30th, 1933, when President Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Hitler as chancellor, the transformation was complete, not just of Hitler, but of Germany itself. The nation that had given the world Bach and Beethoven, Goethe and Einstein, now marched to the rhythm of Horst Wessel Lied and measured its progress in conquered territories rather than cultural achievements. The German people, so recently democratic citizens of the Weimar Republic, had willingly surrendered their freedom for the promise of strength, their individual voices for the roar of the crowd, their moral compass for the certainty of following orders. The early years of Nazi rule seemed to validate this bargain. Unemployment fell, the military rebuilt, and Germany's place in the world appeared restored. The Nuremberg rallies of the mid-1930s showcased a nation reborn, its citizens united in purpose and confident in their destiny. Young German men, raised on stories of their grandfathers' heroism in the Great War, eagerly enlisted in the Wehrmacht, believing they were joining not just an army, but a crusade for German honor and European order. These soldiers, products of a generation that had known only defeat and humiliation, embraced the promise of redemption through conquest. The symbolic object that would come to represent everything these German soldiers believed they were fighting against was as simple as it was profound: a small brown wrapper containing chocolate and cigarettes, stamped with the words U.S. Army K-Rations. In this modest package lay the entire philosophy of American democracy: abundance without conquest, strength without brutality, power exercised not to dominate but to liberate. Yet in 1939, as German panzers rolled across the Polish border, such symbols remained distant abstractions. The immediate reality was intoxicating victory, swift conquest, and the validation of everything the Nazi propaganda machine had promised. The early campaigns of World War II seemed to confirm the Nazi vision of German superiority and destined triumph. Poland fell in 27 days, Denmark in a single morning, Norway in 2 months, and France, the great enemy of German history, collapsed in just 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht's Blitzkrieg tactics revolutionized warfare, combining speed, coordination, and psychological shock to achieve victories that previous generations of German generals had only dreamed of. German soldiers, marching through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, felt themselves part of a historical vindication, the rightful heirs to European dominance their fathers had been denied. But beneath the surface of these stunning victories lay the seeds of ultimate defeat. The German war machine, for all its tactical brilliance, was built on a foundation of ideological delusion and economic impossibility. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people carved from the territories of inferior races, required not just military conquest, but the systematic extermination of entire populations. The Holocaust, history's most methodical attempt at genocide, was not a byproduct of war, but its central purpose, the true goal for which all the tanks and planes and submarines were merely tools. The German soldiers who had expected a series of swift, honorable campaigns found themselves instead participants in a war of extermination that brutalized both victim and perpetrator. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into Eastern Europe, turned German soldiers from warriors into accomplices to mass murder. The clean, surgical victories of 1940 gave way to the grinding, existential struggle on the Russian front, where the rules of civilized warfare were abandoned in favor of a racial war that recognized no limits and accepted no mercy. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, represented Hitler's greatest gamble and his ultimate miscalculation. The German High Command, intoxicated by previous victories, planned for a campaign of perhaps 4 months against what they considered a racially inferior, politically unstable, and militarily incompetent enemy. The reality they encountered was starkly different. A vast nation mobilized for total war, led by a dictator as ruthless as Hitler but commanding resources that Nazi Germany could never match, and defended by soldiers fighting not for ideology but for survival. The German soldiers, who had expected to be home by Christmas, 1941 instead found themselves trapped in a winter more brutal than any in recorded history. The Wehrmacht, equipped for a summer campaign, faced temperatures that reached -50 degrees Celsius, conditions that froze rifle bolts solid and made metal burn human flesh on contact. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking point. Medical facilities collapsed under the weight of frostbite casualties, and the proud divisions that had conquered Western Europe began to disintegrate under the dual assault of Russian resistance and Russian winter. It was in these frozen foxholes outside Moscow that German soldiers first encountered those small, brown packages that would become the symbol of everything they had failed to understand about their enemies. American Lend-Lease supplies, including K-rations with their chocolate bars and cigarettes, began appearing in Russian positions as early as late 1941. To the starving German soldiers, these packages represented not just American industrial capacity, but American abundance, a nation so wealthy it could afford to feed not only its own soldiers, but the soldiers of its allies, while German troops scraped frozen gruel from the bottom of empty cans. The transformation of German expectations was not limited to material conditions, but extended to the very nature of their enemies. Nazi propaganda had taught them to expect subhuman Slavs, who would collapse at the first show of German force. Yet, they encountered Soviet soldiers who fought with a ferocity and determination that matched and often exceeded their own. The Red Army, writing its defense in blood across the approaches to Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, demonstrated that ideology and racial theory were poor substitutes for courage, competence, and an unshakable determination to defend one's homeland. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August 1942 and February 1943, became the graveyard not just of the German Sixth Army, but of Nazi confidence in ultimate victory. Japanese soldiers, expecting to face soft American troops weakened by democratic decadence, instead encountered Marines who fought with a savagery that shocked even veteran Japanese commanders. More disturbing still was the abundance of American equipment. Every American soldier seemed to carry enough ammunition for a platoon, enough food for a week, and medical supplies that could keep wounded men fighting when Japanese soldiers would have been left to die. The symbolic power of American abundance extended beyond mere material wealth to represent a fundamental difference in values and worldview. German and Japanese soldiers had been taught that strength came from sacrifice, that victory required the willingness to die for the state, and that individual comfort was incompatible with military effectiveness. Yet, they faced American soldiers who fought not despite their comforts, but because of them. Men who carried pictures of sweethearts and letters from home, who shared cigarettes with prisoners and chocolate with liberated civilians, who fought not to die gloriously, but to live freely. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, represented the ultimate confrontation between these competing visions of warfare and society. German defenders of the Atlantic Wall promised an impregnable fortress that would hurl any invasion back into the sea. Instead, witnessed the greatest amphibious operation in human history, a demonstration of Allied coordination, planning, and material superiority that made German defensive preparations seem almost quaint by comparison. The Allied invasion fleet included over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 soldiers in the first wave alone, supported by logistics networks that could maintain this force indefinitely. German soldiers defending Normandy found themselves facing enemies who seemed to fight by different rules entirely. Where German doctrine emphasized improvisation and individual initiative to overcome material shortages, American and British forces relied on overwhelming firepower and methodical advance. Artillery barrages that lasted for hours, air support that appeared whenever requested, and supply lines that never seemed to break created a form of warfare that German soldiers, for all their training and experience, had never been prepared to face. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps in 1945 revealed the ultimate transformation of German expectations, not just military defeat, but moral catastrophe. Allied soldiers, discovering the systematic extermination apparatus of the Holocaust, encountered evidence of crimes so vast and methodical that they defied comprehension. German soldiers and civilians, confronted with the reality of what their nation had become, faced the collapse not just of their government, but of their understanding, of themselves and their place in the world. The contrast between American abundance and German desperation became most stark in the final months of the war. While German civilians foraged for roots and bark to survive, American soldiers distributed chocolate bars to German children. While the Wehrmacht scraped together Volkssturm units of old men and boys armed with obsolete weapons, American forces landed supplies by the plane load and maintained communication networks that connected every frontline unit to command centers in Washington. The K-Ration, with its simple message of American plenty, became more powerful than any propaganda film in demonstrating the difference between democratic and totalitarian systems. The surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945, and Japan on September 2, 1945, marked not just the end of the war, but the beginning of a new understanding of the relationship between freedom and strength. The victorious Allies, led by the United States, faced the choice between vengeance and reconstruction, between punishment and redemption. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt war-torn Europe, and the democratic reconstruction of Germany and Japan demonstrated that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to create, not in the power to conquer, but in the wisdom to liberate. Die Betontur. Trials at Nuremberg established a new principle in international law that following orders was not a defense for participating in crimes against humanity, that individuals bore responsibility for their actions regardless of the political system under which they lived. German soldiers and officials, who had expected to be treated as prisoners of war, found themselves judged as criminals, their defense of superior orders rejected by a tribunal that held them accountable not just to military law but to universal moral principles. The post-war testimonies of German and Japanese soldiers reveal the depth of their transformation from confident warriors to broken men grappling with the reality of what they had fought for and what they had become. Klaus Weber, the young German soldier whose story began this narrative, survived the war to spend 7 years in Soviet prison camps, returning to a Germany he no longer recognized. His post-war memoir, published in 1962, captured the essence of this transformation. We went to war believing we were heroes, fighting for our nation's honor and our people's future. We returned knowing we had been fools, manipulated by madmen who cared nothing for honor and less for our lives. The chocolate we tasted in American prison camps was the first sweet thing we had known in years, but it was bitter with the memory of what we had done in the name of greatness. The recurring image of the K-Ration chocolate bar, shared by American soldiers with former enemies, became a symbol of the American approach to victory. Generous rather than vindictive, abundant rather than scarce, inclusive rather than exclusive. This simple act of sharing food with the defeated represented a fundamental difference between democratic and totalitarian values, between a system that sought to elevate all humanity and one that sought to dominate it. The global war that began with Hitler's rise to power transformed not just Germany and Japan, but the entire world's understanding of the relationship between power and responsibility, between strength and morality. The United States, emerging as the world's dominant superpower, faced the choice between imperial domination and democratic leadership, the decision to rebuild rather than exploit, to share rather than hoard, to include former enemies as future allies, represented a new model of international relations based not on conquest, but on cooperation. The Marshall Plan, which invested billions of dollars in European reconstruction, demonstrated that American abundance was not an end in itself, but a means to global prosperity and peace. The chocolate bars and cigarettes in those K-rations became symbols of a larger truth, that true security came not from the ability to destroy one's enemies, but from the capacity to transform them into friends, not from the power to take, but from the wisdom to give. The democratic reconstruction of Germany and Japan proved that nations could be reborn, that peoples could be redeemed, and that the cycle of conquest and revenge that had dominated human history for millennia could be broken by leaders with the vision to see beyond immediate victory to lasting peace. The German and Japanese soldiers who had expected to die gloriously for their emperors and Führers instead lived to see their nations become prosperous democracies, their former enemies become their closest allies, and their children grow up in a world where abundance replaced scarcity as the normal condition of human existence. The Cold War that followed World War II represented the final test of these competing visions of human organization. The Soviet Union, despite its victory over Nazi Germany, maintained the totalitarian model of scarcity, control, and ideological conformity. The Western democracies, led by the United States, offered an alternative based on abundance, freedom, and individual dignity. The Berlin airlift of 1948-1949, when American and British aircraft delivered supplies to West Berlin despite a Soviet blockade, became another symbol of democratic abundance overcoming totalitarian scarcity. Not through conquest, but through persistence. Not through force, but through generosity. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, marked the final victory of the vision represented by those K-Ration chocolate bars over the ideology that had driven Hitler to power and led the world into its greatest war. East German citizens, streaming across the border into West Berlin, carried with them not weapons but flowers, not hatred but hope, not the bitter memory of defeat, but the sweet taste of freedom finally achieved, the transformation of expectations that began with young German soldiers believing in swift victory and ended with them scraping empty cans in Russian foxholes represents more than a military defeat or political collapse. It reveals the fundamental truth that systems based on hatred, scarcity, and domination ultimately consume themselves, while those founded on love, abundance, and liberation have the power to transform even their enemies into friends. The chocolate bar, that simple symbol of American abundance, carried within its brown wrapper the promise of a world where strength served justice, where power protected the weak, and where victory meant not the destruction of one's enemies, but their redemption. In the end, the global war that changed history was won not by superior weapons or brilliant strategy, though both played their part, but by superior values, the recognition that human dignity transcends national boundaries, that freedom is not a privilege to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared, and that true abundance comes not from taking from others, but from lifting them up. The journey from Hitler's rise to power to the democratic reconstruction of his former empire teaches us that the arc of history, while long, does indeed bend toward justice. But only when good people have the courage to bend it, the wisdom to see beyond immediate revenge to lasting reconciliation, and the generosity to share their abundance with those who have known only scarcity. In the end, the sweetest victory is not the crushing of one's enemies, but their transformation into friends. Not the hoarding of power, but its use in service of human freedom. Not the celebration of strength, but its dedication to the protection of the weak and the liberation of the oppressed. The empty tin cans that Klaus Weber scraped in that frozen foxhole outside Moscow have long since rusted away. But the lesson they taught endures. That true strength lies not in the ability to take, but in the capacity to give. Not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to create. And not in the satisfaction of conquest, but in the deeper joy of liberation. The global war that changed history ended not with the triumph of one nation over another, but with the victory of human dignity over human degradation, of abundance over scarcity, of freedom over tyranny, and of hope over despair.